Here's a demo of something I've been working on called the ember-constraint-router, which is going to be an Ember add-on. Let me get right to it. So I've made this thing which is basically an alternative router.map, and just bear with me. I can probably find a way to make this look like the classic Ember router.map that you're used to, but it was easier for me to work with this particular API. So there's some things here that should look familiar. You're still using routes to say here is a route that is accessible via a certain URL, but there's a lot of other stuff here too. So there's this thing called state, which lets you declare, in this case, a state called current user, and then you can match against various states. And I'll show you sort of how this works internally. But what this basically means is that in this case, you're declaring a login route, which is only accessible, only visitable when the current user state is absent. You don't have a current user, so what can you do to remedy that? You can use a login route. And then when the user is present, you have a sort of a nested internal state called current ride, and you can match against the various states of that ride model so that you can only request a ride when you're not riding, and you can only see the riding route when you're riding, and you can only see the ride complete route when your ride state is complete. And so why is this cool? Why would you care about this? Well, it means that if you express things this way, then you've taught the Ember router a lot more about the states that your app can be in. And all those transition twos or any of the complicated logic of like, oh, the state has changed on the server. Let me like quickly check if I'm currently within a route that I'm still allowed to be in. A lot of that sort of tricky logic, which might be foreign to you if you've never had to write lots of WebSocket real-time server-driven apps. But it's really difficult to do that correctly, and particularly with the Ember APIs that exist today, you end up having to sort of write things in multiple places, logic in multiple places, and plug a lot of leaks. So the purpose of ember-constraint-router is to teach the router more tricks so it can do more magical things for you that do the right thing by default. So this is the router.map that's in the demo that I'm about to show you. So here we are. We're currently in the index route, the sort of top-level index route that every Ember app has. And I have a bunch of link tos here. And the only one that is unconstrained, which is that there's no state the app has to be in order for the index route to be visible. The index is the only unconstrained route, and the rest are constrained routes. Why? Because they're declared in here inside these sort of match blocks, and they're only accessible from a certain state. So if I were to try to click the ride complete route, I would not be able to get into it because first of all, it doesn't even get past, it doesn't even get inside of this user present block. It says, oh, the user is not absent. The only thing you can see that's in this realm is the login route. So you get presented with the login form, and then we're going to simulate a user login, which is literally just doing a .set on the model property on this current user service, just like any other Ember service, but one that has some sort of magic sprinkled into it that it makes it sort of routable. And so we're going to simulate user login. That changes the state of the user service, which now has a model, and so now this sort of user present block is accessible. And it automatically redirects you into request a ride. I didn't write any kind of like on user login, on successful login transition here. It's all coming from this logic expressed in this constraint router map. Okay, and so at this point we have a user but we don't have a ride, which is why we're able to see the request a ride route. So this is only visible when the current ride is in not riding, and that's sort of what the default starting state is. So if I click riding or ride complete, nothing happens here. Internally it's trying to transition as if you had gone to a URL and then the before model hook caught it and did some validation, redirected you elsewhere. That's all sort of happening automatically because the current ride state is in the wrong state. And if this were inside the app, it's like you're waiting for the server to send you a message that a rider or a driver has been found and you're now in like the riding state. So we're going to simulate that riding state that the server tells you that you're riding now. And what's happened is that has changed the model on the current ride service. So you've essentially fallen out of this one, and then it has matched against the next state that it can enter, which is riding. So now you're here, and you can't access the request ride route. You can't access ride complete. You can't even access login because you're only supposed to see that route if the user is absent. But you can still go to the unconstrained index route. But if you're in sort of ride routes, this is the only one that you can see. And then if you do simulate ride complete, you're going to fall out of the riding state routes and go into ride complete. So I try to explain why this is an interesting thing, and I think a lot of people just don't really do WebSocket-driven apps, or they just have a sprinkle of it, and so it's really not that difficult to bolt that onto an Ember app. But I feel like this is something most people are going to want soon. Like Ember basically made a bet a few years back that if you're building web apps, you need to have sort of first-class support of the URL, and you kind of need to think about the URL first, which is why the Ember router API basically makes you think. Like if you're going to build an Ember app, the first thing you have to think about are like, what are all the URLs? What are all the different states that my app can be in from a sort of URL standpoint? And you start off building that way, and then you don't have to sort of bolt on really complicated URL routing logic later. And I feel the same way about server-side driven apps, which is that maybe it's not important for you today, but I think you would find that if you were to sort of audit your own app of like what would happen here if we added WebSockets, if we made the server smarter and able to sort of broadcast new states to the user rather than the user having to click around and only hit the server via like AJAX requests, I think you would find that something like ember-constraint-router would be very useful. So I am personally going to try this out over the next few days in my own app, which is, my own app, and the difficulty that I've found in writing it is why I've spent time even working on this in the first place. And if you want to read a little bit more about this sort of problem space and what the big deal is, I wrote this article called Ember Rideshare on my blog called Dunning Poster, and you can read up a little bit more about that. And so please give me some feedback. Let me know if if you'd find some use out of this, and let me know what you think of the API. And some other stuff I'm going to be working on soon is how to combine something like this with stacked routing, which is sort of an orthogonal but also very difficult presently functionality to model, which is unfortunately something that you need if you are trying to make something that looks and feels like a native mobile app. So let me know what you think of this, and yeah, I appreciate any feedback I can get.